In 1087, the funeral of one of history's most feared conquerors turned into an absolute nightmare. William the Conqueror, the man who crushed England beneath his boot and struck terror into the hearts of millions, was about to suffer the most humiliating defeat of his entire reign, and he was already dead. Picture this: hundreds of nobles, bishops and dignitaries packed into a sacred church for what should have been a solemn royal ceremony. Instead, they were about to witness something so grotesque, so unthinkably horrific that grown men would sprint from the building, gagging and retching. Because when the priest tried to force William's bloated, decomposing corpse into a stone coffin that was too small, his body exploded. Not metaphorically, literally exploded. Rotting flesh and putrid fluids sprayed across the altar, covering terrified mourners in the liquefied remains of their former king. What you're about to discover about medieval royal burials will show you that even the most powerful rulers in history weren't immune to the humiliating realities of human biology. This isn't just about one explosive funeral. It's about how the combination of medieval preservation techniques, political delays and basic decomposition created some of the most grotesque royal send-offs in recorded history. Let's start with the king whose final farewell became medieval Europe's most notorious funeral disaster. William the Conqueror died on September 9th, 1087, at the Priory of Saint-Gervais near Rouen, France, after ruling England for 21 years with an iron fist. As one of the most feared and powerful monarchs in medieval Europe, he had built his reputation on brutal military efficiency, systematic conquest, and the kind of ruthless political control that made entire populations tremble at the mention of his name. But here's what makes his story truly ironic. This king, who had spent his life dominating others through sheer force of will, was about to be completely defeated by the basic biological processes of decomposition and decay. William's death itself was unremarkable by royal standards. He had been leading a military campaign against the French king Philip III when he was injured, possibly by his horse's pommel hitting his abdomen during a siege. Contemporary accounts describe him developing fever and abdominal pain before dying in what seemed like a relatively peaceful end for such a violent ruler. The problems began immediately after his death. William had specified that he wanted to be buried at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, Normandy, a journey of nearly 60 miles from where he died. In the hot September weather of 1087, transporting a decomposing corpse across such a distance would have been challenging even with the best medieval preservation techniques. But nobody expected what was actually going to happen during that journey. The moment William died, political chaos erupted around his succession, and this had immediate consequences for his burial arrangements. His nobles were too busy securing their own interests and fighting over inheritance rights to organise a proper royal funeral. Instead of the immediate preservation and burial that royal protocol demanded, William's body lay unattended for hours, while his courtiers literally looted the room around his corpse. Contemporary chronicler Orderic Vitalis recorded that William's servants stripped the chamber bare, leaving the corpse almost naked on the floor. The same people who had feared and obeyed him in life couldn't even be bothered to show basic respect to his dead body. They were too busy grabbing valuable items and fleeing to secure their positions under the new regime. This delay was catastrophic for the condition of the body. Medieval embalming techniques were primitive at best, involving little more than washing the corpse, stuffing the throat with herbs and spices and wrapping it in cloth, soaked with wine or aromatic oils. Without immediate preservation, decomposition began almost instantly in the warm September weather. When William's body was finally prepared for transport, the process had already begun. Historical accounts describe how his corpse was placed in a lead-lined coffin and loaded onto a cart for the slow journey to Caen. But the road to the abbey was rough and bumpy, and every jolt of the cart accelerated the decomposition process happening inside the sealed coffin. By the time the funeral procession reached Caen, several days after William's death, bacterial decay had transformed the once feared conqueror into a biological time bomb waiting to explode. When William's funeral procession finally arrived in Caen, the ceremony was immediately delayed by a massive fire that broke out in the city. While the king's corpse waited in its lead coffin, most of the mourners, including future kings and nobles, ran off to help fight the flames, leaving the body unattended in the growing heat. This additional delay was the final factor that would turn William's burial into medieval Europe's most notorious funeral disaster. Inside the sealed coffin, bacterial decomposition was accelerating rapidly. The combination of warm weather, delayed preservation, and extended transport time had created perfect conditions for catastrophic decomposition. Just as the funeral was finally about to begin, a local man named Asselin Fitzarthur disrupted the entire ceremony by loudly claiming that the land where William was to be buried had been stolen from his family to build the church. What should have been a simple burial service turned into an impromptu legal proceeding as church officials, nobles and clergy tried to resolve this property dispute, while William's body continued decomposing in its coffin. Historical records show that they eventually paid Asselin 60 shillings to settle his claim and allow the burial to proceed. By this point, according to contemporary accounts, the sealed coffin had begun to emit such a powerful stench that people near it were visibly struggling not to vomit. But medieval protocol demanded that the ceremony continue, and nobody wanted to admit that the great William the Conqueror's funeral had become a biohazard emergency. When the time came to lower William's body into the stone tomb at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, the pallbearers made a horrifying discovery. The decomposing corpse had swollen so dramatically that it no longer fit into the stone sarcophagus that had been prepared for it. Orderic Vitalis recorded exactly what happened next in details that still make historians uncomfortable to write about. As the attendants tried to force the bloated body into the too small tomb, the pressure caused William's abdomen to rupture catastrophically. His swollen bowels burst, wrote Vitalis, and an intolerable stench assailed the nostrils of the bystanders and the whole crowd. We're not talking about a minor leak or gentle seepage. This was a full-scale explosion of decomposing royal remains that splattered the mourners, filled the church with putrid gas, and created such an overwhelming smell that people fled the building in panic, many of them vomiting as they ran. The explosion was so violent and the smell so unbearable that the elaborate funeral ceremony, which had been planned for months and included some of the most powerful nobles in medieval Europe, completely collapsed into chaos. Priests abandoned the altar, nobles ran for the exits, and even the hardened medieval warriors who had seen countless battlefields couldn't stomach the biological disaster that William's corpse had become. Contemporary accounts describe how pieces of the king's decomposed body were scattered around the church, and the stench was so powerful that it took days to clear the building enough for normal religious services to resume. After William's body exploded during the burial ceremony, the church officials faced an unprecedented crisis. They had the decomposed remains of one of Europe's most powerful kings scattered around their sacred space, a building full of traumatized nobles and absolutely no protocol for dealing with such a catastrophic failure of royal dignity. Contemporary accounts describe how the remaining clergy and attendants worked frantically to clean up the mess and complete some form of burial service as quickly as possible. They literally shoveled the pieces of William's body into the stone tomb, performed the most abbreviated version of the burial rites they could manage, and sealed everything up while trying to maintain some semblance of royal dignity. The explosion and hasty burial meant that William the Conqueror, who had spent his entire life obsessed with control, power, and maintaining absolute authority, ended up receiving one of the most undignified burials in royal history. The stench from the explosion was so powerful that it lingered in the abbey for days. Church officials had to burn massive amounts of incense and aromatic herbs to make the building usable for normal religious services. Some historical accounts suggest that people avoided the abbey for weeks afterward because the smell of rotting king still permeated the structure. William the Conqueror's explosive burial wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of medieval royal burial disasters caused by poor preservation techniques, political delays, and the basic realities of human decomposition in pre-refrigeration societies. King Henry VIII's burial in 1547 provides another documented example. Historical accounts by Gilbert Burnet describe how Henry's massive, disease-ravaged body was embalmed and sealed in a lead coffin for transport from Westminster to Windsor Castle. But the rough roads and extended journey caused the decomposition gases to build up pressure inside the sealed coffin. According to Burnet, as Henry's funeral procession stopped overnight at Sion House, The pressure from decomposition gases caused the lead coffin to crack and leak. Contemporary accounts describe how blood and fat dropped through the lead in the night, and the next morning servants found dogs in the chapel, licking up the putrid matter from the floor beneath the coffin. The image of England's most feared king reduced to dog food on the chapel floor represents the ultimate humiliation of absolute power. These stories reveal the fundamental gap between medieval royal propaganda and the biological realities that even absolute monarchs couldn't escape. Medieval kings promoted themselves as divinely appointed rulers whose bodies were sacred vessels of royal authority. But when those same bodies were subjected to the basic processes of decomposition, the elaborate fiction of royal superiority collapsed into biological reality. These spectacular failures were predictable consequences of medieval preservation techniques, meeting the basic biological processes of human decomposition under less than ideal conditions. When a human body dies, bacterial decay begins immediately, starting in the intestines, where massive colonies of bacteria begin breaking down organic tissue and producing gases including methane, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide. In medieval times, without refrigeration or sophisticated embalming techniques, this process accelerated rapidly, especially in warm weather. Medieval embalming consisted primarily of removing internal organs, washing the body with wine, stuffing cavities with aromatic herbs and spices, and wrapping the corpse in treated cloths. While this might preserve a body for a few days, it was completely inadequate for the extended periods required for elaborate royal funerals with long transport distances and complex ceremonial requirements. The lead coffins used for royal burials actually made the problem worse by creating sealed environments where decomposition gases could build up pressure without escape. When subjected to the bumping and jostling of medieval transport, these pressurized containers became literal bombs waiting to explode. The political and ceremonial requirements of royal burial were completely incompatible with the biological realities of human decomposition. Medieval royal culture demanded elaborate extended funeral ceremonies that allowed maximum time for decomposition to reach catastrophic levels. Contemporary chroniclers often interpreted explosive royal corpses as divine judgment on the moral failures of the deceased rulers. The ultimate irony is that these medieval kings who had spent their lives trying to transcend human limitations through absolute power were ultimately humiliated by the most basic human biological processes that no amount of political authority could control or prevent. The historical record is clear about what happened. William the Conqueror's body did explode during his funeral, covering mourners in decomposed royal remains and creating such a terrible smell that people fled the church. Henry VIII's corpse did leak from its coffin during transport, leaving putrid matter for dogs to consume on chapel floors. These weren't isolated incidents, but predictable consequences of medieval burial practices that prioritized political ceremony over biological reality. The explosive royal corpses represent the ultimate democracy of death. No amount of political power, military conquest, or divine authority can exempt anyone from the basic biological processes that eventually reduce all human bodies to their constituent elements. William the Conqueror's explosive burial and Henry VIII's leaking coffin prove that death is the ultimate equalizer, reducing even the most feared and powerful rulers to the same organic matter as the peasants they dominated. These medieval kings discovered that while they could command armies and control kingdoms, they couldn't command their own flesh to remain intact after death. The next time someone claims absolute authority over others, remember the image of William the Conqueror's body exploding during his own funeral, covering shocked nobles in decomposed royal remains. That's what happens to all human authority in the end. It gets reduced to organic matter and bacterial gas, regardless of how many people it once controlled. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do these stories change how you think about power and mortality?